This is my historical timeline for acts and cases that influenced English language learners. Farrington versus Toshigi in 1927. This was the Hawaii regulation of hours and curriculum that was taught in the native language of students. The ruling over this made the parent involvement with the curriculum better. The parents were more involved in the classroom and they knew more of what curriculum was going on, and it gave them more of a role in English language learner education. The National Defense Act of 1958. The act came in a response to Sputnik. It was the first act to implement better math, science, and foreign language program. Afterwards, there was a real strong push for math and science. They felt like they needed more mathematicians and people that were smarter in science and foreign language programs to help communicate. This provided a lot more funding to schools, especially for foreign language programs. They promoted post-secondary education a lot, and they tried to really reinforce, like I said, the foreign education for foreign language, and that really pushed the English language learners to be a bigger role and try to get those kids to succeed more in learning both English and whatever their other language might be. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. All schools could not discriminate based on race, sex, ethnicity, or national origin. At first, this act came into place and not many people respected it. It was not withheld very well, and a lot of people felt like this was not really implemented. It was made an act, but it wasn't actually implemented. This was the first step to getting the ELL students help. That way they would not be discriminated based on where they were from or how they spoke or what language they might be in. Next is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. It worked hand in hand with the Civil Rights Act, and it was called the two-step approach. They basically both went hand in hand in helping the resources of an ELL student, like increase or just give these ELL students more resources and gave them better teacher training and developing instructional methods. It made everybody a little bit more developed in doing what they needed to do to help these ELL students. It also addressed the academic needs of poor children, and it just made sure that, like, no matter what your economic status was, you could get an education. Next is the Bilingual Education Act of 1967. It made bilingual education a federal concern and instead of just a state concern. And this had the federal government's now funding schools for bilingual education programs. So before, the states it was a hit or miss if they had good programs or not, and this made it, this act made it to where the federal government kind of overseed the states doing this to try to help them do better in their bilingual education program. And it also gave them more money, because the reason some of these schools could not have good programs because they just simply couldn't afford it. Next is the Cerna versus Portales Municipal Schools in 1974. This was the first mandate for bilingual education. This is the first time anybody said, like, we have to have bilingual education programs. And before this case, parents felt that students were set up for failure in mainstream classes that used all English because they simply just couldn't understand the curriculum. And they basically were told if they couldn't understand it, then they were just out of luck and there was no helping them. And many students were dropping out because they were either falling behind and failing, or they just had fear of falling behind because they'd seen what it had done to other people. Next is Law versus Nichols in 1974. This is the only Supreme Court ruling for language minority students. It began with a child failing because they didn't understand the language, and a lawyer heard about the family's case, so they brought it to Supreme Court, and Um, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the family and made it mandatory to offer bilingual education programs. They saw that the student was not getting the help that he needed, and obviously something needed to be done about this. So they made it mandatory to do bilingual education programs to try to help ELL students on all platforms. Next is the Equal Education Opportunities Act of 1974. It made it illegal to discriminate against staff of school while also prohibiting any type of segregation of students. So this not only helped reinforce the Civil Rights Act, but it also made it illegal to discriminate against staff. So you can now get a job if your primary language wasn't English, and then again, it does not. They still can't segregate against students for however they speak. This also made school districts address student disabilities more and their learning disabilities and learn more about them and how to help these students. And this also made ELL students now get the curriculum that they desired and that they really needed. Next is Castaneda versus Pickard in 1978. The family felt as though their kids were not getting the instruction they needed because of their ethnicity. This school did not have bilingual education programs, so they felt as though they were getting discriminated against, and they didn't have the good education programs to help them get past this. So this case made it to where they have a 3-part assessment for bilingual education programs now. And lastly, there's the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. This reinforced the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It made states test for basic skills and set a standard. These states could put their own unique spin on the test, but they had to have a state test that tests for these standards. And the states receive federal money for giving tests across their selected grade levels. Whatever grade levels they were supposed to give the test for, they got money for it. And the ELL students now were held to a standard and received the necessary help. So if the school saw that a student could not pass the test due to their language barrier, then an ELL student now had this standard, so they could easily receive the help they needed with that federal money in order to make sure they learn the content as well. And this is the resource page.